All right, here we go. This is our last biogeochemical cycle for apes for this year, and we're going to be covering the nitrogen cycle, and it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's kind of fun. So we'll start with our sun. Our sun's like, whoa, nitrogen cycle. It can be a little confusing, but that's okay. We're going to take it step by step. So nitrogen, atmospheric nitrogen, is written as N2. This is atmospheric nitrogen gas. And it is the most plentiful gas in our atmosphere. It makes up 78% of the atmosphere. And the interesting thing about that is nitrogen is an essential part of all living things. However, N2 is a form that is not usable by most living organisms. So the nitrogen cycle is all about how we can make nitrogen gas into a form that's usable by plants and animals, and then how it cycles through the soil, and then eventually back into the atmosphere. So we're going to start over here with the process of changing that nitrogen into a usable form. It's called nitrogen fixation. Okay, so nitrogen fixation happens naturally two different ways. One is through bacteria found in the soil, and the second natural way is through lightning. And the third way is not natural, it's a human caused way, which is through the production of fertilizer. So fertilizer production, which comes from our use of technology. All right, so we're going to sketch our little landscape. We've got a little hilly landscape here, and over here we got a few trees, our token trees, and then we've got a little river coming through down the hillside, and this is going to be kind of a cutaway to show us what's happening under the ground. So there's our little hillside, peaceful place, and then over here we have a factory producing fertilizer. All right, so fertilizer production. So this is going to be labeled fertilizer plant. And this third method of nitrogen fixation, again, was created by humans through a process called the Haber-Bosch method. And it revolutionized agriculture because prior to the invention of this technique, we were always short of nitrogen. Nitrogen is the essential element needed for plant growth. It's a limiting factor for plant growth. And so having lots of available nitrogen made it faster and easier to grow food for the world. But this process, called the Haber-Bosch method, was created to sort of simulate one of these natural processes, which is lightning. So when we have a storm and there's lightning, these flashes of lightning can cause some of this atmospheric nitrogen to be converted into some of these natural forms of nitrogen compounds that can be used by plants. But what are the chances that you're going to have lightning strike on your farm at just the right time? So it's not a very reliable technique to just depend upon as natural lightning. Okay, so our third method of nitrogen fixation was nitrogen fixing bacteria. So bacteria are going to play a really important role in the rest of this story. So we're going to represent them with these little dots. So the first ones we're going to talk about are the bacteria that are found in the root nodules of legumes, which are plants in the bean family. So they have these little nodes or nodules that are all along their roots, and they are the homes of these specific type of bacteria. And it's a symbiotic relationship, it's mutualistic, because the plant provides a place for the bacteria to live, and the bacteria in turn convert nitrogen from this unusable form into a form that's usable not only by the legumes but by other plants around them. So lots of farmers will use legumes in their fields to enhance this natural nitrogen fixation process. So their job is to change into nitrogen gas into a form called NH3, which we also know of as ammonia. You may have ammonia around your house for cleaning. It's really super stinky, but I don't know. I don't like it, so I don't keep it around my house. But there are some people who clean windows with ammonia. I'm going to circle this so we can kind of keep these processes going in bubbles. So the ammonia is then changed to a chemical formula NH4 plus, which is ammonium, and then it's converted into a process called, into a chemical compound NO2, which is nitrite, and eventually converted into NO3, which is nitrate. So lots of steps in this pathway for bacteria to convert nitrogen into a form that is usable by plants, other plants as well. Okay, so that is a process. This whole thing is kind of the process of changing the nitrogen into a usable form by bacteria, is called assimilation. I'm sorry, that's not the name of that process. That is the process. So let me go back to the story. So here we had nitrate and NH4. These processes are converting the nitrogen into a form that's usable by producers, and so the producers are then taking up the nitrogen products, and then consumers are feeding off of them. Here's our friendly cow we've seen before. Your cow will be much better than my cow. That's one of the worst cows I've ever drawn. My apologies. Okay, so this cow is eating the grass, so it's taking in these nitrogen compounds that have been converted by the bacteria into usable form. They were taken up by the grass, and now the cows can eat them as well. And eventually, the cows will die, and they'll return that nitrogen back to the soil. But let's stop for a second and let's name this process. This process is called assimilation. Okay, so that's the process of producers when they take up nitrogen from the soil, and then consumers eat them. Okay, so step 1, nitrogen fixation. Step 2, in between that we had nitrogen. All of this was nitrogen fixation. Now we're on step 2, assimilation. So our happy cow is eating the nitrogen in the form of the grass, and that's assimilation. Okay, so next thing we have going on is we have, sadly, cow death. So rest in peace, cow. It was nice knowing you. dead cow. So dead cow, and that, then we have bacteria in the soil that take over the process of converting the the nitrogen compounds in the cow's body back into the soil. This is called ammonification. So bacteria decomposers in soil and water break down nitrogen compounds into NH4 plus. Okay, ammonification. All right, we want to go back and label the step of what happened over here in this process as well. This step 4 was called nitrification. I know this is a lot of words that start with N. Nitrifying bacteria convert ammonium into nitrite and then nitrate. Hope you can see that. Okay, good. All right. Not sure if you can see all those steps. So that's what we're seeing. That's the name for this step over here, kind of along the way. Okay, so we've gone through this process. We had nitrogen fixation, either by using fertilizers, putting the nitrogen in the ground in a usable form by plants, lightning, changing some of the atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form for plants in the soil naturally, or these nitrogen fixing bacteria found in the roots of legumes, bean plants, that are converting this nitrogen into forms that are usable by plants. And we have animals eating those plants, taking it up into their body, making that nitrogen part of their body tissues, their body compounds, was assimilation. Over here, we talked about how when the cow dies, our dead cow, we have nitrogen compounds being returned to the soil in NH4 form. Over here, we're talking about this process of nitrification, where the bacteria, new sets of bacteria in the soil, were converting ammonium into nitrite and nitrate. Whew, it's a lot, right? Okay, so over here, we're going to come over here, and we have some of these end products. This is our river, by the way. And we have a process where we were left with this NO3 nitrate, and some of that is going to be converted by bacteria back into nitrogen gas and another compound, nitrous oxide. So we're going to put that step right here. This is called denitrification. Sorry, I didn't come up with all these names that sound so similar. Denitrification, so breaking down the nitrogen compound, denitrifying. So the denitrifying bacteria convert nitrate, NO3, and nitrous oxide back into atmospheric nitrogen gas. Okay, so we see this compound broken down and these bacteria returning some of that nitrogen back to the atmosphere in the form of nitrogen gas. So let's add some arrows. And one more thing I want to point out right here, we're not going to talk about much more today, is that some of this N2O, nitrous oxide, escapes also into the atmosphere and becomes a greenhouse gas. So that can be a byproduct of agriculture. Okay, so let's make some more arrows to kind of connect all of these pieces. So we had lightning, we had fertilizer factory contributing to this, atmospheric nitrogen conversion, and we had the bacteria doing all of this work over here, including the bacteria that break down the cows and return that nitrogen back into the soil. So, let's add some bacteria over to show these are bacteria doing all of this conversion, all of these steps. All right, so I know it's a lot. Let's add a little color, but before we do that, let's talk about why is nitrogen important to living things. Nitrogen is an essential part of all proteins, DNA, and RNA. So it's an important part of every living thing, and it is the most important nutrient for plant growth. So we would say it's the limiting factor for plants in terms of their growth. All right, so a little color to help kind of set some things apart here. How about some yellow for our lightning, a little for our sun. It's like, whoa, I just learned a lot about nitrogen. Whew. Okay, and so over here you had bacteria. Let's color some arrows to kind of show these three processes. To the fertilizer factory, nitrogen fixation, to the fertilizer factory, through the lightning, and through the process of bacteria, which is naturally occurring. Okay, and then I'll color my little factory, a little gray. All right, I'll color my water. And one of the things we're going to be talking about is what happens when we have too much nitrogen. Usually we have too much nitrogen in the environment. It's eventually going to wash into our bodies of water and lead to the process of eutrophication, which leads to algal blooms, which leads to dead zones, and that's a huge issue for us. We're going to be hearing more about. Got our trees. And most of our eutrophication comes from this process of nitrogen fixation. We don't have excess nitrogen in the environment because of these two natural products. It's coming from this human invention, this technology that we use to simulate lightning to produce nitrogen at a large scale that's very, very cheap. Again, it changed agriculture, changed the face of agriculture. It became part of a key factor in what we call the green revolution. We're going to talk about in our agriculture unit. Okay, so step 1, nitrogen fixation. Step 2, assimilation. Step 3, ammonification. Bacteria converting these back into dead things back into NH4. Nitrification over here. The bacteria that are doing these chemical conversion steps. We've got our producers that were part of assimilation. And our consumers taking that nitrogen into their bodies. Denitrification. The process, kind of the final step where bacteria are converting this leftover nitrate and nitrous oxide into nitrogen gas to kind of complete the cycle. Although some of that nitrous oxide does escape and lead to greenhouse gas, production of greenhouse gases. Let me add a few more arrows just to show the flow here. Okay. I know it's a lot. Let's flip it over really fast. And I want to show you my little cycle shortcut that I came up with. Have you ever had naan bread? I love naan bread. It's like the Middle Eastern flatbread. It's so yummy. And so here's my nitrogen cycle shortcut to help you remember the steps. So non, N-A-A-N, and then D, non-D. Okay, so N, nitrogen fixation. 3 ways: bacteria, lightning, or fertilizer production. Okay, A was assimilation, where nitrogen is taken up by producers and consumers once it has been fixed. A for ammonification, which was bacterial decomposers. Once again, kind of changing the form of nitrogen around. Nitrification is next. This is when another type of bacteria, the nitrifying bacteria, once again change the form of nitrogen. And denitrification, last step, when denitrifying bacteria change it back into nitrogen gas. So this side, this sort of like shortcut notes leaves out some of the chemical compounds. So if you're not feeling real great about the chemistry, and I don't want you to focus so much on the changes and the names of those chemical compounds, but I do want you to know at least kind of these basic steps of what's happening, and just know the names at least, and kind of be able to explain what's happening on a more general scale without necessarily using the names of the chemical compounds, just knowing that the processes are taking place. So non-D. There we go.